Our next speaker is Dr. Swapan Dasgupta. Swapan Dasgupta is an Indian politician and journalist known for espousing the cause of India's right wing in the Indian political theatre. He is known for furthering the cause of Hindu nationalism in the English media. He regularly writes in leading English newspapers and presents BJP's perspective on national issues. He was, until recently, a member of the Rajya Sabha. He resigned from the upper house to contest in the West Bengal Assembly elections 2021. He remains one of the most prominent centre-right intellectuals today and is known for his consistent attacks on the left liberal commentators. Dr. Swapan Dasgupta will now speak on our history, wars, and national identity.
Namaskar. Thank you very much for attending this session in the mornings. I know it's always a difficult time to come and extricate yourselves from whatever you've got to do in the mornings, your daily chores, and come for a session on history. I'll start off with where the India Pride left off. Now, you looked at a very, very moving scenes, depictions of idols stolen, idols buried, gods re-established as murti. And you look back and you wonder, why did this happen? And it's not happened in a small one or two things. It's happened on a monumental scale. And we've just only about established the tip of the iceberg. Every museum you go to in the West, you'll find examples of Indian gods, goddesses, artifacts, entire sections of temples there. Why? And this is the question which has often plagued us. You know, when the Ayodhya demolition took place in 1992, Vidya Naipal, and I always found him a very quaint but a very astute observer of India. He said in an interview at that time, he said this was the revenge of a defeated people. Now a lot of people, a lot of well-meaning people sort of said defeated people. They took strong objection to that term. But it's not something which you need to take very strong objection to. If you look back at the Tryst with Destiny speech which Jawaharlal Nehru gave, and I personally believe it was a very moving speech. There's a very important line there. And it says, the soul of a nation long suppressed. It's very important. So the idea that a soul of a nation has been suppressed has been there for a long time. Going back to Aurobindo, one of his most evocative speeches was what is called the Jhalakkati Speech, in case some of you may have read it. And he spoke about what is the aim of Swaraj. And he said, we seek fulfillment of our life as a nation. In other words, we haven't yet got that fulfillment. It's an incomplete task. And here we are talking about defeated people, voice, soul of a nation long suppressed, seeking fulfillment. And Modi ji, when he addressed Parliament in one of his earlier speeches in 2014, spoke about 1200 साल की गुलामी की मानसिकता हमें परेशान कर रही है. So it's that same feeling. And if you look back at history, if you look back at the 19th century, and my concerns are mainly 19th and 20th century histories, you'll find that all through, the prominent Indian figures the Indian figures which came to prominence in the public eye, they addressed one simple question, all over. Why did India become a subordinate people? So when we talk about a defeated nation, we are not necessarily denigrating ourselves. We are talking about what the reality is. And the reality of subjugation is what concerned everybody. Whether it was Bhandarkar or Ranade in the Mumbai presidency, whether it was Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, whether it was others, it was the same sort of question. Why did India become a subject nation? And Aurobindo also devoted himself. And they all had different prescriptions of how do we get ourselves out of this. I refer to this in the present context because today we have a very vicious battle, vicious not in the sense of a physical battle, but a battle going on at the intellectual level over our past, about what India meant. And the temptation has often been for people who share our civilizational concerns to often say, we are a proud people, our history has been distorted, we are not a defeated people, we are an ascendant people. And that this history must be rectified. There are times when this is actually true, but we must qualify it. Firstly, there is a problematic. When Indians, our civilization talks about history, we have a very different approach, which is very different from how the chronicling which was done in the West, or even in the Islamic world. Firstly, I think it's important to realize that for most of the people who believed in Sanatan Dharma, the important thing was to get personal salvation. It was to establish the individual's communion with God. And you achieved that through getting a guru. But it was always a personal quest. It was always. It was very rarely a collective quest. And as a result, we tended to focus primarily on the individual experience. And that individual experience was rarely recorded. So the idea of recording it, whereas everything that the Prophet Muhammad said was dutifully recorded, sometimes accurately, sometimes not so accurately. I'm not going into the accuracy or historicity of all those things. Likewise, the entire tales of Jesus were faithfully and again, sometimes with accuracy, sometimes with embellishments, recorded 200, 300 years after his crucifixion. That same principle very rarely happened in India. Part of it also was that whatever may have been recorded also got destroyed in the process. A lot of it was the work of nature, a lot of it was work of invaders, etc. It's a combination of both. We yesterday heard about the fact that the Chanakya's Arthashastra was found purely by accident. And about 150 years ago, the existence of Ashoka was not even very well known in this country. It was not. It was just thought of as some minor dot on the surface. So our own history has, in a sense, never been systematically recorded, which is why in the 11th century, the Arab traveler Al-Biruni said, Hindus have no sense of history, because they also don't have a sense of chronology as we know it, because they look upon it things as yugs. So the yug is a little more flexible in terms of its chronology. It's more expansive, and it doesn't carry the same. So the issue of history as a discipline, as we know it, as a modern discipline in India, is relatively new. And it was something which was introduced first, to some extent, by a lot of the Islamic travelers who came in. They looked at a lot of chronologies, etc., court chronicles, etc., and subsequently by British civil servants mainly, not professional historians, but very dedicated civil servants who were actually quite attached to whichever. I mean, James Todd's Annals of Antiquities of Rajasthan is probably the first modern book which was done by someone who actually fell in love with that place. I mean, let's not undermine their contribution. If Lord Curzon hadn't set up the archaeological survey, India would have been much poorer today. I mean, Curzon may have had his other shortcomings, etc., and he had a certain attitude. But he also looked upon the safeguarding of India as his sacred duty in his own worldview. So that sense of what exactly was history is something which is relatively new. So the biases, misconceptions, etc., we have naturally been, very predictably, been transplanted into this sense. One of the major things which has happened, and why, is that the emphasis, the overemphasis on the written word, the overemphasis on archives. The archives in that sense didn't quite exist in India. The court chronicles. We only get some sense of it from about the Mughal times, and not even from the Delhi angle, but from the provincial archives, from them. We also tend to discount, till very recently, the evidence of ballads, of what is called the oral tradition. In India, most of the tradition happens to be an oral tradition. For instance, a recent controversy has come about what was the outcome of the Battle of Haldighati. Who prevailed in Haldighati? Now, there are differences. There are recorded evidence of some people, and then there is the evidence of the balladeers, of the ballads, which talk about the victory of Rana Pratap. Now, obviously, the oral tradition of what is called collective memory, historical memory of people. Ayodhya was another classic example of that. People were surprised. They said, we don't find, Tulsidas never wrote about Ayodhya's destruction of the Ram temple. This was one of some historians wrote about it. Tulsidas may not have written about it. But when the memory of a particular site remains in the local folklore, there is some basis to that. It's not always completely erroneous. It's not manufactured. And subsequent excavations have demonstrated that what was said was probably true. There was a temple. Whether it was exactly a Ram temple or not, but it was a temple which the locals believed was of the site of Ram. And yet we have had lots of people who utterly spurious evidence. If you go into the judgment of the Allahabad High Court in, I think it was 2010, an entire section is devoted to the utter spuriousness of the claims of the historians. I wrote a long piece on just getting together all these people who tormented us for a very long time and how they'd actually destroyed it. So What I'm saying is that there was an incomplete. Then there was a way of reading the texts. How do we read texts from the archives? The archives put forward. Here there were some very interesting insights which were given by the subaltern historians, where they talked about the inversion of the text. What the text says, you take the opposite meaning and you'll probably get what exactly is happened, and you'll try and get at a balance of what. So history writing in India, in that sense, is still a very, very recent discipline. And it was colored by the fact that we were for the first time trying to establish two or three things, very contradictory and sometimes confusing attitudes. Were we a defeated people? Did we have a glorious past? What does that past have an impact on the present? Questions like that. Question of Shivaji, for instance, take this example. Now, some of the most pioneering work on Shivaji was done by a few Maratha historians, like Sardesai, and then by Sir Jadunath Sarkar. Now, Sir Jadunath Sarkar was a very interesting man. He was a complete loyalist. He believed that the advent of British rule in India was the best thing that had happened because it saved India. He believed that. And he was not the only one who believed that. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee also believed that. But he also believed that the rigor of actually trying to understand the text of of the documents. So the real, to understand the texts, you have to know it, you have to absorb it, and you have to go strictly by what the evidence of the texts go, and you can't deviate from it one way or the other. So he was a very, very orthodox historian in that sense. And Jadunath Sarkar was very impatient of those people who at that time it was a done thing in nationalist propaganda to compare Shivaji with, say, Mazzini, to Garibaldi, to Cavour. He said, what rubbish. Don't implant the 19th century onto something which was happening in the 17th century. But at the same time, from his own thing, he said that the larger significance of Shivaji was not lost on him. He proved to the world, as Jadunath Sarkar wrote there, that the Hindus can found a state. Because the idea of India being a nation has also been a very problematic one and been a very contested area. To what extent is India a nation? Some people would say India is multinational. India is much of a nation as is the equator. I think it was Churchill who said that. Sir John Strachey, another very distinguished civil servant, he said, the first thing we must learn about India is that there never is and there never was an India. So it was merely thought to be something of a geographical expression. And because they applied the rules of the nation state, which was there in Europe, which came about from the Treaty of Westphalia, and that, is there a single language? No. Is there something we have a common mode of worship? Yes and no. There may be certain common assumptions, but no. I mean, my worship is, if I may say so, strictly non-vegetarian. And a lot of people in the south and in the north have a very strictly vegetarian form of worship. Does that mean there is no commonality? So how the nation is forged was something which has always been an important factor in history. It is only now that we are looking at other features. We are looking at facets. Like we are looking at India as a sacred geography. A very nice term used by a Harvard professor called Diana Eck. Now, what is very interesting about Diana Eck's book, which and she's also written a fantastic book on Varanasi, is that if you read the foreword, she said, I would have written and published this book many years ago, but I feared that this book might have been used for a different political purpose. So a lot of history can be conveniently put aside just because it doesn't suit a political agenda. But the idea of the sacred geography, what does it mean? It means that India was linked in many ways through what might be called the pilgrimage routes. The Tirthasthans of India cross linguistic barriers, geographical barriers. There's north of the Vindhyas, south of the Vindhyas, in Dwarka, in Kamakhya, in Mansarovar. So the idea of the geography, whether you take the geography of the Mahabharata, the geography of the Ramayana, or you take the Puranic geography, you'll find this thing, the thing of India as an entity. Professor Radhakumud Mukherjee in the 1920s wrote this book about actually tracing back from old scripts of how the idea of India, he wrote this lovely lecture which was given in the University of Mysore in, I think, the 1920s sometime, about the fundamental unity of India. But, and here is the biggest but which I'm coming across, the idea of a unified state in India, the political logic which often governs nationhood, was something which Indians lacked. Why? Because the idea, if you look at all the texts, you'll find what is the importance of life. It is to uphold dharma. This is the principal idea. The upholding of dharma is a man, an entity, the king, everybody's. I think the important thing is that. That is the principal task of the state. But the state was never thought to be that important. It was always secondary. It was so a political theory, as far as India was concerned, our own traditions, we lacked that. I mean, if you just come across Arthashastra is one. Arthashastra is one, and it also contains about how it's more a practical guide to how kings should operate, send spies here, send other forms of temptation there, do a bit of duplicity, this, that, and the other. It's not a rounded theory in that sense. But it's one of the very few ones which we have. Maybe there were others. They haven't survived. Because there's been a discontinuity. Memory. In India, there's been what the invasions did was that they broke our memory at different points. One of the reasons why the Natarajas are being buried, and that was also what happened in other forms of life. That's symbolic, in my view. The Natarajas were buried. And some of them were buried and lost. And we have lost a lot of tradition in India, in that sense. So this rupture in our history is something which we have always got to confront. So when we talk about the past and things. So the creation of a political tradition is something, again, which is relatively new. Which is why a lot of people think about the Constitution as being the defining hallmark of India. Now that's a very, I've often, and this is an idea which they've taken from a German scholar called Jürgen Habermas, who talked about constitutional patriotism. And it was in the context of Germany that this idea came about. And the idea came about for them that 1945 in Germany was like year zero, because they didn't want to talk about what happened before 1945 for understandable reasons. So for them it was the year zero was 1945, and therefore everything started with the idea of the Constitution. Now you apply that logic to India, Was 1950 a year zero for us? Did India exist or not exist prior to 1950? The Constitution is very important. It defines the rules of the game. It defines the rules whereby public life is governed. But it does not define our nationhood. It doesn't even begin to touch what our nationhood is. So, when we talk about history again, this idea of what the nation is, if we get convinced and totally influenced by a certain reading of the world which exists in the West, we are likely to come up with conclusions which, to say the least, are a bit partial and sometimes completely flawed. There has to be an India, there has to be works of history which really go much beyond that. And it is in this context that I would say that as far as this writing of history is concerned, this civilizational writing of history is concerned, we fell behind a lot. From about the late 1960s, I mean more the 1970s, our universities became completely, gradually, particularly our social science and humanities departments became completely taken over by the left. And what does it matter? It matters because research grants, what is the subject you take for your research thing, those were sort of influenced and totally determined by them, to the extent that there is now a stranglehold. So anyone else who decided either opted out, didn't even bother about it, or decided to become amateur historians. It's very interesting that some of the more interesting works which have come about of late have been written by people who are outside the formal departments of history and politics. They've been scientists and who, as a matter of passion, who've done this. Now, those works are very insightful. But as a result, they don't touch the discipline in a frontal sort of way. So they are sort of neglected. I remember my son who was studying history about 10, 12 years ago, or maybe a little while ago, and I asked him, did you read this particular book? And he said, no, that's not considered kosher, because it wasn't written by historians. So there's a process of deliberate exclusion. The other problem which a lot of historians, some of those people have suffered, is that accessibility. Now, one of the countries where history is in very strong popular demand, where everybody writes history, everybody reads history, is the UK. If you look at the number of titles published each year, and see their sales also, you'll find that the number of popular books on history, sometimes written by historians, but more often than not written by others, including politicians, have a great deal of sales. Why? Because the idea is to one of communication to come out. So the language of history is very important. It's one of the greatest regrets that the old-fashioned narrative history, whereby the argument is woven into the storytelling, that style of writing has been lost in India. It has not been lost anywhere else, but it has been lost in India. We've been overcome by a sense of jargon, by a sense of spurious post-colonial writing, which is incomprehensible to 95% of the people. It just is complete gobbledygook. And I would urge a lot of people here, please, for heaven's sake, do not be influenced by that. A lot of people have When my friend William Dalrymple, I call him my friend because he is someone who's passionately interested in India, perhaps with a little bit of expediency involved. Why is his books so popular? Because he tells a story. And he tells a story beautifully. He looked at documents, for instance, when he did his research on 1857 in Delhi, on documents which had been in the National Archives ever since they were found from the Mughal courts. No one had looked at them. And the professional historians were very angry when he said, why has no one even looked at them? Why am I being the first one? He got a professional translator to do it, but that's all right. And he told a story. And he told a story which was very interesting because it pointed out that here amongst this amity of this great Delhi, there were the jihadis who were playing their own little game inside Delhi, and how an overwhelming number of sepoys could not vanquish the tiny British contingent which had stayed on the ridge. It was a very interesting story, very revealing story. But the important thing is that the story was told with great deal of communication skills. And that communication skill sometimes is lacking in a lot of the modern works. Earlier, when people like us used to study history, we were told that it's equally important how you express it than as much as what you are saying. Because it's important. Today, that how you're expressing it has been lost in this thing about what is called the objective type questions and answers, where, is someone good or is someone bad? Now, come on. If life was that simple, is someone good and someone is bad, a lot of problems in the world would have been easily resolved. So the idea that the gray areas, which is where the complexities of a nation are studied, has to be absorbed, communicated, and the nuances. So there is always not a very simple answer. And when today we are at the cusp. I was looking back at how in my childhood, every 15th August or 26th January, each newspaper used to publish supplements and things like that on the Republic Day. In those days, I remember most of them used to have titles like "Whither India" or "Was Partition Inevitable?" Things like that. And then you look back at the 50th year of our independence, which happened in, I think, 1997. And there was always this sense of, incompleteness. Have we are sort of a drifting thing. I remember Firdaus Kanga, this writer in Mumbai, actually wrote something leaving was an idea we grew up with. Therefore, the fulfillment of a middle-class Indian was how do you depart and buy a one-way ticket out of it. So from there, we have come a very long way when we can actually today, with great deal of self-confidence, talk about how India aspires to be a Vishwaguru. And it's not merely an aspiration. It's something we are somewhere near about. Of course, we've got a couple of miles still to run. And it's that change, and in that change, recreating our past, linking our past in an intelligent way, in an informed way, not in a propagandist way, is very, very important. So while we talk about the scientific temper, sometimes we emphasize the temper part more than the science. It's about time we think about having a sense of history and proving Al-Baruni wrong. Hindus too also can have a sense of history. Thank you very much.